Hello, and welcome to the recorded content for Segment 2 from the New Learners Wave 1 workshop. This is Will Jernigan presenting this recorded content. Hopefully, if you're watching Segment 2 now, you've had a chance to review Segment 1, where Kate Gassner was presenting on the AWWA M36 foundations for the water audit, water balance, and the methodology behind it. What I'm going to do in Segment 2 is to cover the tool, which is the free water audit software from AWWA. We'll talk a little bit about the data validity grading, and then we'll talk about how to get ready once you've reviewed this recorded content for Wave 2, which will be a teleconference we'll be conducting in the coming months. Let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing we want to look at is the AWWA free water audit software. We'll take first a look at the mechanics of the software, and then we'll get a little bit deeper as we go. Hopefully you've had a chance to at least have some exposure to this tool, but if not, that's okay too. This is a tool that was developed about 10 years ago by the American Waterworks Association, and it was made freely available for the water industry to become essentially a common or standard format for conducting a top-down water balance that Kate was telling us about in Segment 1. So a couple of things to note off the bat about this tool. It is set up in multiple sheets. The sheet that you'll primarily work in is called the reporting worksheet, and that's the screenshot we're looking at here. It does have color coding on it that does dictate which cells are input cells. Those white cells are where we want to enter a value. If you see a yellow cell, that represents a calculated cell. You do not need to enter anything there. And then we have a purple colored cell that is representing where there's an option to utilize a default. And so as you go through this as the person populating the information in the audit worksheet, you'll have the decision if you want to utilize the default or use a value of your own. Functions of the AWWA software: once you supply the inputs, it does develop a water balance for you. It does calculate an overall data validity score, which we'll talk about more in just a few minutes. It does calculate a suite of performance indicators that are helpful in evaluating your water loss performance. And then it does give some guidance on areas to focus for improvement. So let's go to a quick overview of the actual tabs. As I mentioned, the reporting worksheet is where you'll do most of your work for the audit process, but the instructions is the place you want to start, because there is where you specify your utility specific information. And here's what that looks like. Providing the name of the utility and the contact information, etc. That's basically administrative information. But down here at the bottom, here's one that is critical for the function of the reporting worksheet, and that is volume of reporting units. It's important to specify. If you're a California utility, you might be working your audit in terms of acre feet. You also might be working in terms of million gallons. So this is where you would specify that on the reporting worksheet down here at, the instructions worksheet down here at the bottom. Moving over to reporting worksheet, here we have a zoom in to the first section on that reporting worksheet, which is called water supplied. Just to give you a flavor of how these inputs generally work. Here over to the right, we key in the volumes, and as Kate told us about some of the terms and definitions, we talked about volume from own sources, the water that you produce on your own, water imported that you perhaps purchase or bring in from an outside source, or water exported that is sold in a wholesale type manner out of the utility. So those are all volumes that get keyed in. Next we have the definitions for each of those. So if you find yourself trying to remember what a particular input represents, you can always click the question mark right beside it, and that will take you to the definitions tab, which exists. It's built into the spreadsheet, but simply clicking on the question mark will automatically take you to that spot where you can read the definition to refresh and then come back to the reporting worksheet to continue your work. Right next to that is a plus symbol that is very helpful for capturing comments. There is a comments tab that is built into the tool as well. And by clicking the plus symbol of a given input, it will automatically take you to the comments box for that input over on the comments tab. And that's a great place to capture notes. As we go a little bit further into this segment, we'll talk about the types of things you'll want to note and write down as you're developing the inputs and the grades for your water audits. Speaking of grades, what we see next is the data grade that goes with each input. And for each input, we can see, if we hover our mouse over the data grade box beside the input, what pops up is a 1 to 10 set of criteria, and this is referred to as the grading matrix. And we'll talk a little bit more about the grading matrix in the latter part of this segment. But the data grade is qualitative but specific, and the way this works is looking to assign an overall grade out of 10 to the particular input that captures how reliable we believe the number to be, and it's supported by the utility's practices around how that number is generated. In a little bit, we'll talk about specifically walking through that process of selecting the right grade and talking in a bit more detail about that. Overall, filling out the software, it's fairly straightforward. It was designed to be hopefully an intuitive tool, but it does require, much like painting your house or some a painting project of some type, there's a lot of prep work really that goes into it. Gathering the data and supporting documents, doing some level of review on those audits. First and foremost, we're going to focus on the building blocks of developing the audit. We are going to, a little bit later in this overall program, get into methods around really finding those hidden errors or hidden inconsistencies or inaccuracies that can exist. That's not necessarily our prime focus right now, but as we are gathering the data, it is good to keep in mind, is our data complete? Is it consistent? And is there anything that we are seeing as we are gathering it that might suggest it's not accurate? And if so, we can look into it at that time. So just kind of have that on your mind, that we want to be diligent as we're gathering that data. Really, once all of step 1 and 2 are done, the entering the input is a fairly straightforward exercise. That's not a big part of the overall effort, but it does require putting the information into the cells, the appropriate cells, and making sure that we've got them in the right input box. Providing a comment on the source of the data, where it came from, anything around the integrity of that particular piece of data. A bit later we'll talk about specifically what are some good things to note, but for the gist of it at this time, know that writing down your thoughts or comments related to it is extremely helpful for when you look back on this information in the future. And by the way, this is an annual exercise per the mandates in California, so these are good things to leave yourself a good trail of breadcrumbs as you go. And then finally, selecting a grade to capture the data validity for each input. And we'll talk a bit about that more later in this segment. Once inputs are populated into the reporting worksheet, volumetrically a water balance is generated. And Kate in segment 1 told us about the volumetric inputs of the water balance. System input that goes as water supplied breaks down into authorized consumption and water losses. Further break down into subcategories, both billed and unbilled, but authorized consumption. And then, of course, in our water losses, 2 types, real and apparent. Those further break down, as you can see in the water balance, to subcomponents. Overall, the tool applies these volumes to the water balance, and that's a function of the tool. So you don't have to do that. Once you put the inputs in, the water balance is developed for you as a function of the tool and how it's built. In addition to volumetric inputs, which include the water that you supply into the system, if you purchase water, the water that you sell, if you flush water, all of those are volumetric inputs. In addition to those, there are some other parameters that are called for on the reporting worksheet. There's a section called system data that speaks to the physical parameters of your system, such as how many miles of main do you have of pipe under the ground, and what is the total count of service connections. A couple things to note in that miles of main calculation. We do want to attempt to incorporate the hydrant lead links as well as on the count of service connections. That is intended to represent physical points of service, those service lines, so it would include inactive services. Typical examples would be a vacant house or a vacant lot where a water service line does exist, but there may not be active usage. So keep those in mind as you're interrogating perhaps your billing system or whatever data system you have to determine the number of service connections. Overall operating pressure, this is intended to reflect a single number to reflect the average operating pressure across the network. So if you have multiple pressure zones, you do need to keep that in mind, take it into account among different zones. But overall, the relevance of this particular piece of information helps to allow the tool to calculate what's known as the technical minimum volume of leakage, which incidentally is a very system-specific number. And every system holds some level of technical minimum that leakage cannot be reduced, physically cannot be reduced below. That number is not zero. The target for no system is zero leakage. And so that technical minimum allows us, looking at the audit, to understand current levels of leakage relative to that technical minimum. We'll get into that a bit more as the program goes on, really not part of this introductory segment, but it is good to know that that operating pressure is an important input for later. The last section on the reporting worksheet is known as the cost data, and it has three inputs. The first one is usually a fairly straightforward number to derive. It's called the total annual operating cost. It is specific to your water system. Typically these numbers are very well tracked in budget documents. They're well audited by financial professionals on an annual basis. But this number is aiming at the total fixed and variable cost to operate the water system for the audit year. The next two are a couple of unit cost inputs, and the first one is called customer retail unit cost, and this is essentially the unit cost by which the apparent losses are valued. And remember, those apparent losses include the majority of those apparent losses typically involve customer meters that are under registering for any reason. And so when a customer meter under registers, there is an impact to the revenue that is generated from that bill, from that account. And so the value of that apparent loss is therefore at the retail rate. And that is what the customer retail unit cost is intended to capture. On average, what do you charge per unit if it's 1,000 gallons or per CCF? What do you charge to your customers for the next unit of water consumed? So for that reason, we want to be careful not to include fixed revenues, which typically can come from your base charge on your bill. As we move forward in the program, you'll have an opportunity to practice how to do these calculations. But for the moment, just want to understand in concept what they represent. And then finally, there are the variable production costs. This is the unit cost by which leakage is valued. And a good way to think of that is what costs do we have that go up when we produce the next unit of water, typically the next 1,000,000 gallons of water. And the most direct and obvious ones of those involve additional chemicals and additional power. There are a few other indirect costs that can go up as you make the next unit of water, and we can get into that as the program goes. But know that primarily we're, at least as a starting point, looking at those direct costs. And we normalize that chemical and power costs divided by the amount of water produced in the audit year to determine a dollars per 1,000,000 gallons typically. So that variable production cost allows us to put a value on leakage, and when we mitigate leakage, it incrementally reduces our cost to produce. The water audit software has a tab called the performance indicators, and if you think of the reporting worksheet as where the inputs live, you could think of this as where the outputs live. And those outputs are, you can see some that are specifically highlighted there. Overall, the volumes up top of apparent and real losses, which total up to water losses. The costs annually for those apparent and real losses, in particular, those are of interest. The performance indicators does include reference to non-revenue water as a percent of volume supplied, and then the non-revenue water cost as a percent of the operating costs. Generally, we are not looking at those figures. AWWA has moved away from utilizing or really looking at percentage-based metrics to track water loss performance for a number of reasons. Suffice it to say that it's a very unreliable metric. It can often tell you a story that is not the actual case of what's happening in the system. So it's generally been abandoned, and we're looking more at volumetric and monetary indicators, the dollars and the gallons. Down below we have operational efficiency indicators, and what's interesting to note about these is they are normalized. So up above you see the total annual apparent loss volume and real loss volume for the year. Down below, these are normalized on a gallons per connection per day. And this is a good way to allow yourself as a utility to benchmark, and that benchmarking can be comparison against others, although we often encourage that the most meaningful comparison is benchmarking against your own performance over time. How are our metrics looking this year versus 2 years ago versus 2 years from now? Something like that. Down below we have the final indicator on this particular sheet, which is the infrastructure leakage index. We'll get into that one as we go a little bit deeper in the program. It is simply a comparison of our total leakage volume to that technical minimum we compared earlier. So in this example, this utility is operating at 5.5 times its technical minimum for leakage. It's a good at-a-glance indicator that's allowing for site-specific conditions, utility-specific parameters. The next tab in the free water audit software, this is another outputs tab, but it's really kind of got a dashboard function to it. So it's more of an at-a-glance, and a couple interesting features on this. To the left, the water balance is simply presented in a column chart format, and so each of those elements in the water balance is shown in different colors and different ratios on the left. The even more interesting component of this dashboard, in my opinion, is the volume and cost toggle feature. So over here to the right, all of these elements displayed on this chart to the right are components of non-revenue water, the metered and unmetered unbilled, which are the first two, unauthorized consumption, customer metering inaccuracies, and systematic data handling errors. Those are the three subcomponents of apparent loss. And then, of course, total real losses. Just a quick reminder, the water audit does produce, the top-down water audit does produce a total real loss volume. It does not break it further down into its subcomponents. That is a follow-on activity that really comes later. So don't worry too much about that right now. But the interesting feature here, you can see it'll toggle between the volume and cost. And so you can get at a glance not only the total volume and cost of your non-revenue water, but how each of those components compares, and which ones might be the winners as relatively compared to the other components. With the toggle feature, you can also get a pretty good appreciation for how volumes and values don't always track the same. And remember that retail and wholesale relationship between apparent and real losses. In this particular case, you can see that customer metering inaccuracies is clearly far more of a cost than real losses. But if we were to toggle the volume button, that relationship would inverse. The real loss volumes would be quite a bit more than the customer metering inaccuracies volumes. So a good example of why we always want to look at both volume and costs when evaluating where we should prioritize our attention. In the work session in person, we had an opportunity to do an exercise with the software. If you're watching this from home on the recorded version, I would encourage you to go to awwa.org/water loss control. That is the place you can go to download the free water audit software. You will need to put in your name and email, and essentially they will email you a link to download it. It is a free download. There's no cost. Try it out. Just get a copy of it. Play around with it. Go around through the different tabs. Put your information in. If you are participating in the water loss TAP, then you are an urban water agency in California. So that by definition means that you've already, or at least your agency has already, utilized the free water audit software as part of your urban water management plan submittal this past July 1st. Now, you may not have been the one who was directly involved in that, so if you have not had an opportunity to, I encourage you to go download a copy. If you ever forget that web address, you can always just Google AWWA free water audit software, and it'll get you right to it. Let's turn our attention now to the notion of data grading. We talked a little bit about it as we were walking through the mechanics of the AWWA spreadsheet. But I want to do a little bit of a deeper dive in this and talk about how you actually go about selecting the appropriate data grades for each input. And that is part of the top-down water audit, is to give a grade to every input. And that's incredibly important. It's actually one of the characteristics of the AWWA water audit method that distinguishes it from really any other water auditing method in the industry, is that it allows the characterization of the data to go hand in hand with the actual volumes and analysis on the data. So to get into that discussion, to get our minds set, let's think about the concept of inaccuracy and uncertainty on our inputs is absolutely going to affect what comes out of the audit. So the outputs rely upon those inputs, and therefore any error or inaccuracy that exists in those inputs, we'll see that on the other side, and so we have to be careful. And I will say that in no system is the goal to have perfect information. In many systems we've worked with, we've never ever seen data that was absolutely perfect, and I really don't think that's the goal. The goal is to be able to have a good understanding of the reliability of the data and understand how close to accurate it is, and therefore we can make informed decisions about using those results to guide smart activities for controlling water loss. So where and why does inaccuracy introduce into our processes? We have instruments that measure. A great example is a source water meter. That is not a perfect piece of equipment, and there are certain flow ranges or certain times or certain installations that can affect how accurately that instrument performs. So we have to be aware of that, recognize it. Databases, that information typically can feed into perhaps a SCADA system, using our supply meter example. And those databases aren't always perfect. There are things that can happen in there. Certainly the human element can play in when we handle information that introduces the possibility for error. Although I will comment that overall, simply folks doing the math wrong is not the type of inaccuracies that we're really on the hunt for here. Although that can occur, and we do need to be diligent about it, we want to understand that the systems that are in place that produce the information we need to use for these inputs for the water audit, they themselves are not perfect, and we just have to recognize that and move forward with that in mind. So let's take a look at how we actually walk through the process of selecting the appropriate 1 through 10 grade. And the screenshot we have here that we are looking at is an example of one of the inputs and the grade, the criteria that go with it for volume from own sources. General comments about this grading criteria: it is qualitative, but it is specific. So these are objective criteria and the overall idea is to minimize any level of interpretation or assumptions that are needed. The caveat with that is that the data grading matrix, which is the assimilation of all of these different criteria, in and of itself was designed with the recognition that there are over 50,000 water utilities in the United States, and there's never ever going to be one set of criteria that perfectly describes all of those utilities. So there's some recognition that in looking at this, you have to consider your own operations, but use it with an objective lens as you're walking through this process. So let's do that, and let's kind of talk through the thinking process for selecting the right grade. General rule of thumb: you're looking for the highest grade where you meet or exceed all of the criteria within that grade and the criteria in the grades below it. So one way that generally is advised to approach this is by starting with a 1, read through the criteria of a 1, and if you find that you meet or exceed all of the criteria in a 1, move on to the next grade up, a 2 in this case. For a 2, you would read through those criteria, and you would determine if you meet, or if the practices in place at the utility meet or exceed those criteria, and if that's the case, move up to a 4. Do the same, and so on and so forth. And what you're aiming for is when you get to a grade where you read through it and perhaps you meet some of the criteria but not all, what you do at that point is to fall back to the next grade down, and that would be the grade you would land on. So if you read through a 4, you met or exceed all of those. Read through a 6, and you met some but not all, you could go back to a 4 and then make a decision if you were going to go with a 4 or a 5, and that is some of the flexibility in this grading matrix, that you could choose a 5 if you felt like you exceeded everything in a 4 but didn't quite land on a 6. In the example we were just looking at, those 1 through 10 grading criteria came about as a pop-up box on the reporting worksheet, and you can access that by simply hovering your mouse over the small white box immediately to the left of the data input that you are looking at. And when you do that, the 1 through 10 comment box will pop up, and you can use that to read. Another way in which you can access that same information is actually a separate tab within the AWWA Water Audit software. It's called the Grading Matrix tab, and it lays it out in a line for every data input. It has its own line, and it describes the same 1 through 10 criteria. So you can essentially use that the same way you would use the pop-up box. The bonus feature for using the Grading Matrix tab is that underneath every line for a given input, in addition to that first line that describes or guides you on picking the right grade for now and what captures what's happening today, the line below it provides guidance on how you could move from today's grade up to the next highest grade. So in the screenshot we're looking at there, if we were at a 4 for that given input, below you can see it says to qualify for a 6, and then it provides some specific actions that could be taken to move from a 4 up to the next highest grade, which is really can be very helpful. It moves it not only as an evaluation tool to assess what grade we're at today, but also as a planning tool to help us guide our next steps. So let's now turn our attention to documenting the basis of your audit. Just a quick word or two on, as you are developing the inputs and developing the grades for your reporting worksheet, what are some things that you want to make notes of? What are some things that are good to document in the process? First of all, get all your data in one place is extremely important to get your mind set, to get all that information in a single location. Typically, you're going to be dealing with digital information, so you might have a digital file. Occasionally, you may have some physical records as well. but try to get it all consolidated in one place. As you're developing the inputs, oftentimes you'll need to do some work, such as do a calculation, perhaps make an assumption, although it's great to minimize assumptions, but you may have to make an assumption here or there to do a calculation. So those are good things to write down. Those are good things to note. Show your work on how you arrived at a particular input. Remember, the comment sheet is a built-in feature inside of the Water Audit tool that provides you a place to make those types of notes. If you're ever in doubt about what to write down, my rule of thumb is to imagine yourself 6 months from now when you pick this up and in need of remembering how you came up with the number and how you came up with the grade. And as much as you can write down to retrace that to where you'll look back at that and it will be transparent, it will be easy to recall. That's the type of information you want to write down. So in particular, here are some suggestions for, at a minimum, what to make note of as you're developing. Let's go to data inputs first. Start with the data source. The data source would be the record or the set of data from which it came. So if you were talking about a billed volume, you might identify the name of that billing report that it came from. And that's especially important because oftentimes a particular piece of information might potentially come from more than one report. And you might have for example, a monthly summary or a monthly register or whatever your billing system and billing department may refer to that as. So it's important to identify which source you got that particular number from and where it originally came from. How did you derive it? Certainly basic of adding up 12 months of consumption, but if there was any further derivation that occurred, show that or make a note of that, and that's going to be very helpful in the future. Any assumptions that you did make, again, we want to minimize or completely eliminate assumptions if possible, but in the event that you find you are having to assume something, make sure to write that down because that will be important to refer back to. And then finally, if any action is needed, and a good example of this might be we had to make an assumption because we didn't have, let's say, the finished water meter test report. So we made an assumption on the master meter error adjustment on the supply volume. Maybe we put that in, but the action out of that was to get in touch with the company that came in and did that particular test, obtain a copy of the report, perhaps to even incorporate into this year's audit, or at a minimum to make sure we incorporate it into our future auditing work. So that's an action. That's a really good thing to write down in your comments tab so that it doesn't get lost, doesn't get forgotten. And again, your future self will thank you when you pull this out months down the road and you've written those types of things down. It is good to note if there are any questions that still are looming that need to be answered from there, and that can build on what you're documenting in your data inputs. Over on the data validity side, when you've chosen the grade, it's really good to make a note of the basis for that. Remember, you're picking a 1 through 10. You're reading those criteria. You're looking for the number where you meet or exceed all of the criteria in that number, as well as all of the numbers below it. So the basis for the grade selection is important to note. In particular, if you got to a 6, read through a 6, and you met or exceeded all of those, and then you looked up at an 8, and maybe you met some of the 8, but there was one in particular item that you did not meet in the 8. That would be a good thing to document, because then remember when you're picking this up months down the road, you can look back and easily and quickly recall why you didn't go with an 8, why you went with a 6 or a 7. So those are the types of things that it is good to document. Similar to the inputs, the reasons for documenting assumptions, action needed, and questions. If ever in doubt, more is better than less when it comes to making notes for yourself in the comments tab as you're developing these inputs and these grades for the water audit. All right, in wrap-up gear for segment 2 here, let's talk quickly about how to get ready for work session 2. Just to recast, this is a recorded content for work session number 1, which was held in a a classroom environment. It was an in-person work session. And if you're watching this, it may mean that you for any reason were not able to attend. That's fine. Watching this recorded content is part of getting you ready for work session number 2. Perhaps you did go to the class and you just wanted to refresh or to review this information, and that's fine too. In addition to watching this recorded content, though, we have some homework that we would like for you to do to prepare for the work session. And that work session is in Wave 2 is going to be a teleconference. So we need you to do a couple things. We want you to gather your water audit and supporting documentation that goes along with it. And in just a moment, I'm going to walk through the specifics on that supporting documentation. The water audit in question should be the one that you most recently submitted with your Urban Water Management Plan by July 1st of 2016. And that generally is going to refer to either your fiscal year 14-15 or calendar year 2015, depending on whatever you chose to base it upon for your Urban Water Management Plan submittal. We also want you to bring any questions you may have about the methodology, the inputs, and the results. Just basically any questions that you run into and you'd like to have some direct assistance on. Remember, this Wave 2 work session is a one-to-one work session, whereas the Wave 1 was a one-to-group, where we had teachers in a class environment doing the work session with many utilities. Wave 2 is a phone call specifically between the expert team and your water audit team. So we'll be able to talk specifically about your utility. Let's go to the supporting documents, and at the end of this segment, I'm going to provide a web address where you can go, and if you ever forget any of this, you can always go to this web address and recall and download a sheet that's got each of this listings for these supporting documents. But just for a moment to give a quick narrative to it, certainly your most recent water audit is part of the package. That's one we just mentioned. But if you have any previous water audits, we would love to see those. Those may be helpful in our call. Ideally, if you have done them in the AWWA format, that is the preferred format. If you haven't and you just simply have previous water loss tracking or anything that's not necessarily in the AWWA format, that's fine as well. We will take that. If you've been doing any water loss control efforts to date, we'd love to see any and all documentation from that. If you have not been doing any water loss control efforts, that's fine too. Certainly anything else you think might be helpful out of your Urban Water Management Plan submittal. Over on the water supplied section, the particular documents and data that we're interested in here is a summary of the supply meters that you have, and in particular this is looking at the meters that measure finished or treated water that you're producing and putting into the system, if that's the way you're set up, if you're a production system. So you may have raw water meters that are measuring extraction from the source, and that's fine, but the supply meter demographics, and when we say supply meter, in particular we're interested in those meters that measure treated water put into the system. If you have a setup that you just have the one meter and it's essentially perhaps a well meter, and there is no finished water meter per se, just send us what you have and we'll work with the data that you have. Documentation on any testing activities that may have occurred, and general statute of limitations here, just in a rough time frame, is about the last 5 years. So if you had, say, testing and or calibration activities conducted on your supply meters, but it was over 5 years ago, we wouldn't worry too much about that. But if it's been within the last 5 years, then that would be of interest, and we want to see that. Schematic of the system showing the overall layout. This is one where you may have just a simple high-level map of the water distribution network. Perhaps it shows where the supply enters, if there are import-export meters. And oftentimes that level of a map may also show distinct pressure zones. Just a very, very high-level understanding of the layout of the system would be helpful if it's something that you have and are available to provide. Let's take a quick look at the next few sections. Authorized consumption. We're interested in volumes of water sold, And we'd like to see those broken down by month, by rate code. And by rate code, usually some people may interpret this particular term different than others, but generally speaking, the rate code is the code in your billing software that allows it to understand how much to charge based on a certain type of use. So if you have a tiered structure, you might have a different rate for that first tier versus the second tier versus the third tier. You might have a different rate code for perhaps a residential versus a commercial use, etc. So to the extent that your billing software will accommodate, we would like to see the volume of water sold by month by rate code. If you have one of those nice billing softwares that is not quite as friendly at providing that, just do the best you can. And that really goes for all of this data that we're asking for. If you hear us asking for something and can't quite provide what we're asking for, or perhaps it's not available, but perhaps some version of it is, just do the best you can. Provide us with what you can, and we'll work with you. That is part of the Wave 2 call, is to talk through any data gaps and help to move forward. Wave 2 is not the end of this overall program, so we'll have an opportunity to work through data gaps in Waves 3 and 4. Just to quickly mention a couple of the others that may not be quite as self-explanatory. Overall miles of main and number of connections. This is something that is a direct input into the water audit software. We are asking for that on a per zone basis. If you are one of those systems that simply has one zone, one hydraulic zone that operates, then that's very straightforward. If you have more than one pressure zone, we would love to see it on a pressure zone basis. But again, the caveat is if that's not information that is that you can obtain relatively easily, then just do the best you can, and we will work with whatever you're able to provide us. And finally, on the cost data, we're looking for information that largely would typically come from your annual budget documents, those that are prepared annually and audited by typically by financial professionals. So this is really the type of thing you probably can provide this to the folks in your finance department, and they can work with you to provide it back. The depreciation schedule is probably the one out of this list that would not be included in the normal annual financial report, or at least the budget document overall. It might be a separate document. So we're looking for a depreciation schedule for the water assets. In essence, the amount of value that is depreciated annually for the inventory of the water assets and the itemized inventory. So not just the total number, but the actually listing of the assets. Rate code key is one that would refer to those rate codes when we were talking about authorized consumption and looking for the volume sold by month by rate code. This is simply a key that would identify what those rate codes are, a simple definition of the actual code and a description of what that code represents. Typically this is just going to be something that may be pinned up on the wall of perhaps one of the billing clerks for reference. It may be an output or a quick print from your billing software that might describe what each of those rate codes means. That will help us as we are reviewing the billing data or the billing reports. As we mentioned earlier, if you have any questions gathering the supporting documents, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are here to assist and happy to hop on the phone and talk through any questions you run into as you're gathering this information. So what happens from here, in addition to the homework assignment I just described regarding the gathering of those supporting documents, we will be in touch with the primary point of contact at your utility to work on scheduling the Wave 2 work session. And a reminder, that is going to be a teleconference, so we'll have essentially a master calendar of available time slots, and those time slots will probably be 2-hour time slots. And so essentially we will reach out to you, the primary point of contact on your team, and say, hey, here's all the available slots. First come, first serve. Pick the one that works best for your team's availability, and it'll be generally from October to February, so you'll have a nice several months of window to pick from there. So that is a look at segment 2 for the overall introductory wave, the wave 1 work session. Hope this has been helpful. We have developed a resource page. You can go to californiawaterloss.org, and on that resource page, all the information that we've covered today, as well as information for the upcoming waves, can be accessed there. So this is a good one to refer back to if you do need to recover a piece of information or a particular file or slides from a workshop or anything. So keep that in mind. And then the way to reach us directly, if you'd like to talk or have a question, or if you just want to say hey, we're at waterlosscontrolcollaborative@gmail.com. Thanks again for watching, and we look forward to working with you in Wave 2.